Welcome to FoodTech Stories. I'm your host, Megan Thomas, a marketing and communications expert who is focused on how emerging technology is adopted in food and agriculture. On each episode, we talk with leaders, innovators, and storytellers who are shaping the future of our food and food system. If you value our content, please consider subscribing. Today on the podcast, my guest is Kathryn Cook, who is CEO and founder of NuCicer. Welcome to the podcast, Kathryn.
Thanks for having me, Megan. Super excited to be here.
Let's jump right in. What is your background by training?
I was new to the food and ag space when I founded NuCicer. My background by training is as a material science engineer. So I spent many years of my career doing material formulations actually for aerospace, paint, sealants, adhesives, carbon fiber reinforced plastics. Definitely nothing edible, but very important for flight and corrosion resistance. I shifted over into more of a technical program management role and found myself in big tech back in the mid 2010s when there was a push to deliver internet to remote areas through ultra high unmanned aircraft. It gave me a foot in the door into some of the early machine learning and AI work that was going on at Meta. And so I spent a few years after my career in aerospace helping out with some of the early voice assistants.
That's fascinating. How have you found that experience has translated into your role as a founder and CEO?
Moving industries from aerospace over to the tech world was a big shift. I honestly have leveraged both of those back experiences in my current role. If you think about aerospace, you're working on a physical product. You're working on long lead times for manufacturing, physical assets, manufacturing, and food and ag has a lot of similarities there. It takes time for development. You can't just toss more software engineers on it and grab a few more computers. There's been a lot of similarities I've been able to pull over from that. And at the end of the day, ingredients are just materials. The time I worked on some of the voice assistant technology and looking at some of the early machine learning models and the big data sets has been instrumental because while I'm not a geneticist, there's a lot of the same challenges in terms of getting high quality, large data sets, understanding the physical traits of plants, understanding their genetic footprints, and how do you handle that data? How do you put it through complex algorithms to extract an understanding? While food and ag isn't an obvious stepping stone, it's actually a really interesting intersection that I've been able to pull from.
Yeah, I think that diverse backgrounds are always helpful because they can provide that integrated foundation. And I like the parallels that you drew with aerospace and equipment systems oriented work with the work of food and ag, because I do think it's very similar. Tell us a little bit more about the work of NuCicer.
We're a crop improvement and crop design company at the end of the day. So we are working to unlock the full potential of chickpea and really bring it back as a staple ingredient in modern day food. We really look at not just the grower. We have to be addressing their requirements, yields, disease tolerance, plant height, so it's harvestable, and many other traits. When we think about how crops are being used, and you think about corn, wheat, soy, rice, big crops, they all address downstream food system and other industry needs. Think about most of them being very starch heavy, thinking about how they are milled in existing facilities, how they fit into the food that you and I eat in pastas and baked goods and snack foods. If you want to bring a nutrient dense crop like chickpea and actually make it successful so that it can deliver on its promise of protein and fiber, we actually need to make it fit into that existing ecosystem. And in today's world, with all of the computational genetics and the understanding of what's driving some of the key traits, we have the ability to really push the crop instead of just using processing to get it there. So, what we are focused on initially is increasing protein, reducing fat content in the chickpea to really make it suitable for existing milling and manufacturing infrastructure. That's what we've been working on to date. And we leverage a very unique germplasm library. It comes from natural wild diversity. My co founder is also my dad, and his team at UC Davis went into the wild and collected thousands of samples of wild relatives of modern day chickpea and started to physically cross pollinate those back with modern elite cultivated varieties. Leveraging that diversity really has given us the ability to access new traits naturally that weren't previously accessible.
Yeah, I think that's a definitely a unique approach. In the US, how concentrated is the kind of chickpea growing?
Most of the chickpeas in the US are grown in the Pacific Northwest region, eastern Washington, Idaho, all throughout Montana, and then western North Dakota. We're talking about 500,000 acres of chickpea production. So it's not tiny, but it's also not massive. It's a double edged sword in many ways, but from a startup perspective, it's actually a really nice size from it, going back to infrastructure to disrupt because you can start to fit into existing manufacturing facilities at a slightly earlier stage than you would be able to get to if you were trying to disrupt, let's say, soy, where you're dealing with tens of millions of acres and you need to be at hundreds of thousands of acres before you can really fit into existing systems.
Actually, the industry here is bigger than I would have thought, that there are many more acres than I would have anticipated. Obviously, in those really big acre row crops, you're going to have a lot of competition too, especially in the innovation space. Why did you all select chickpea in the first place? What was the reason?
The reason is really twofold, and it comes back to both human and planetary health. If you think of chickpea, it's a nitrogen fixing legume. It has the ability to really regenerate soil health, support no-till systems, reduce nitrogen usage for the next crop in the rotation. But it's also the nutrient dense ingredient that is, if you look across pulses and you think about your common beans, black bean and kidney beans and pinto beans, and you think about all your lentils, it's actually the most neutral tasting pulse out there. So we're starting with the canvas, if you will, with existing varieties that are good. And what we're doing is taking this untapped wild diversity, natural diversity, and we're bringing that back into our breeding library so that we can actually transform the chickpea from where it is today. If you think back 60 plus years, this is a similar process that a lot of our other staple crops went through. They went through this discovery phase where they brought back wild diversity. They understood how the genetics linked to traits, and they started these massive breeding programs for wheat, corn, soy, rice, potato, other big crops. That never happened in chickpea. So not only are we starting with a really great pulse that can help with some of our global metabolic crisis, some of the cardiovascular health that helps with fiber as well, and gut health, but we have the ability to optimize it where it previously didn't have that attention.
Yes, you're using modern tools to kind of unlock some of that opportunity, that latent opportunity with the crop.
We think of modern tools, and I often think of there's traditional breeding where you cross pollinate two plants and it's relatively slow. It might take a decade to get a new variety or new trait. And then you think of marker assisted breeding where you understand a few markers and how those link to traits. And then you think of CRISPR and mutagenesis and pieces that you have to understand a gene and what it is doing. What we're doing is actually none of the above. What we're doing is addressing some very complicated traits. Protein is not driven by a single gene or even two or three genes. It's extremely polygenic. It's complicated. It's similar to yield and some of the environmental resilience traits. You need very large data sets. And it's really just in the last several years that AI and machine learning technology is at the level that now we can take these massive data sets and essentially predict and put all the information into it and say which varieties should I then leverage traditional breeding, cross pollination to it's almost like rapidly evolve this crop and bring it into modern day. That's kind of where we're focused. It's a little different than what you might think of as like technical breeding, the new era in my mind of where breeding is going.
What more can you tell us about the actual technical approach that you're taking?
We basically take what I would call precision agriculture, drone images of our breeding sites, looking at what we call high throughput phenotyping, or in other words, kind of characterization. So looking at the physical attributes of the plant through image recognition. We take pictures of the seed, pictures of the plant, pictures of the plots. We take a near infrared analysis to look at protein composition in the whole seed. And that allows us to generate information that is no longer subjective to human input. And instead of getting one or two data points, we get 100 data points. That allows us to generate these very large data sets quickly. And we've optimized them for chickpea, and they would actually be easy to optimize in other crops as well. And then we put them into our machine learning algorithms and we say, okay, if we understand, and this is also what I think sets NuCicer apart a little bit, if we look to understand what's driving decision making all the way across the value chain. So again, not just the grower, they're so important, but also how is the processor cleaning out the seed? How are they cleaning out dirt, sticks, rocks? How are they doing their milling? How are they blending with other flours or protein ingredients? How are you and I making our decisions when we go to the grocery store of what we're going to eat? Taste, texture, economics. At the end of the day, we essentially normalize all of those requirements and we say we could boost yield, but there are all these other things we could adjust in our breeding process. How do we create the maximum value for a variety? And then we work across the supply chain to do that. Once we have that model, we predict the parents. We then simulate a full breeding program. We simulate multiple crosses and we put it into the greenhouse where we control temperature, humidity, daylight length, and even the light intensity and force the plant to essentially think it's late summer and it wants to grow very quickly. That allows us to condense 10 years into 3 or 4 years of breeding and launch new varieties very quickly.
You touched on kind of those consumer facing traits, what folks are looking for. I did actually work in the plant based product space in the end of the last decade when it was such a hot sector here in North America. Taste is most often the number one thing they're looking for when they're selecting a food product. And the issues with off flavors and masking of flavor in pea and soy and other alternatives was a real issue for many of the players at that time. So I think it's a great point that you bring out that neutral taste profile of chickpeas. So that's a really important leg up as you get into that end user. And then thinking about the processor as well is key. And sometimes it feels like that piece is missed, where it's the field and it's maybe the consumer, but that the processing aspects and really getting the fundamentals right in that place, which are so important, is really crucial.
I couldn't agree more. When we think about the movement that's happening with getting rid of some of the artificial colors in our foods, there's a lot more attention to what else is going into these formulations to essentially fix the gaps that the industrial era crops, the legacy that those are holding over. They're very starch rich. And when you start to fractionate them, or when you start to try to bring in some of the soy and pea and lentil proteins, now you're dealing with those off flavors. It's an important area to watch. And I think it can absolutely be addressed through breeding and kind of improving the crop itself. There was a conference recently I went to that called out the silent middle of the value chain. We talk about the growers, we talk about the consumers, we talk about even the food brands. I really liked that term silent middle because it's a very complicated web of stakeholders. You've got your distributors, you've got your grain elevators and primary processors, you've got your milling companies, you've got the blending and texturizing companies, the value added ingredient companies. There's a lot of influence that occurs there. I think all of it is good intentioned, but there's a lot of legacy systems that are in place. Going in and trying to say we're going to change all those legacy systems, you receive a lot of pushback. Understandably, these are businesses and it's an important part of the supply chain. But if we can go in and say, let's take a crop that hasn't been optimized and let's make it fit into the existing systems, now you're talking their language. And I think we need to be looking at that more. How do we collaborate across the value chain rather than just trying to say, this part isn't working. Let's just go in and surgically adjust that one piece.
The changeover cost, the risk associated with some of these equipment required, it's that headset change, but also the investment that has to take place. It sounds like your approach is a wise one. You've recently announced a partnership with Strix Ag. What can you tell us about that?
We're super excited to be working with them. We're working with Strix, who today is a major player in the chickpea space. They work directly with growers throughout Montana. They then do a lot of the early processing. So they bring in the grain from those growers, do the seed coat removal, cleaning of the grain, and then they work directly with milling companies to sell chickpea flours. So what we're doing is bringing a new variety, a high protein, low fat chickpea variety to the table. It unlocks a high protein flour for Strix to bring to the market. And we're leveraging our understanding of what that high protein flour can really do in many of those product applications. It's a really great partnership between the two of us. It gives us access to their scale and the quality and reliability of their supply chain. And it gives them access to new variety that otherwise didn't exist before.
What is chickpea flour? Which applications is it particularly well suited to?
We see a lot of immediate opportunity in pastas, snack foods, and baked goods with the rise of pulse-based pastas. There's been a lot of chickpea pasta in the market over the last 10 years, probably at this point. And we see opportunities to help improve flavor and texture in those pastas. And then snack foods, you think crackers, puffs, chips. There's an opportunity to incorporate, instead of having to move to a purified protein ingredient, just incorporate a high protein chickpea flour. I've done some case studies with cheese crackers, for example, that are about double the protein and 3 times the fiber of a standard cheese cracker, all just using a simply milled high protein flour.
Going at snacking is wise. I mean, 90% plus of Americans snack every day. Fitting into those eating occasions and what is familiar to people, the formats they're picking is so much easier than trying to change human behavior. It's very hard to do that. So I'd love to talk a bit about your journey as a founder. What did you learn in the early days of NuCicer? And remind me what year you were founded?
We officially, on paper, were founded in 2019. We really got started in 2020. Boots hit the ground, started to work with some of the early library, and we had our first grant from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research that gave us the financial injection to actually do something.
Getting boots on the ground and starting out when COVID-19 was obviously a huge impact in 2020. How do you think that shaped the company?
We started off as a 3-person founder team. I was the only full time person at that point in time. And it worked well because initially we were out in the fields doing our first field trial. So out in the open, the three of us, sometimes bringing our significant others to help plant or harvest, which was great. So we had our own little pod. And I think as the world kind of came out of those initial lockdowns, there was also a lot of online connection. As an early startup, you don't always have the resources to travel everywhere and meet everyone in person. That actually, I would say, was to our advantage. Everyone was very happy to jump on a video call and connect and to learn about something new. That really got us a lot of engagement back in 2020.
The founders who I have spoken to who were launching their businesses in 2020, at the time it was very challenging, but it absolutely made them more resilient as leaders and the company's more resilient from that period of time. What role has venture capital or other investment, you mentioned your initial grant, played in your growth and in your future plans?
It's been an important part of our growth to date. We have investors both from the pure VC world, Lever VC, Rhapsody VC, Better Ventures, for example, that have been really great partners. We also have some corporate venture capital partners, Leaps by Bayer, Illumina Ventures, and one CPG company that also joined our last round. I'm really excited to be working with all of them. It's been great as a founder working with many of these folks. They bring their connections, but also they've seen many startups go through the whole life cycle. If you're open and willing to ask what might be silly questions as a first time founder, when you talk to a lot of different people, you can start to get view of where others have learned the hard way, some pitfalls to avoid. It's been great working with the community. Fundraising is a challenging environment out there for sure, and I don't want to make light of that. But there are some great relationships and support that we've gotten along the way from our investors as well.
Do you participate in other food tech or ag tech activities or events or any different ways within the ecosystem itself?
We go to a lot of the trade shows. One of my favorite is going to the Institute for Food Technologists, which happens every summer. There's a national IFT event in Chicago, which is a lot of fun. I get together with some of the local founders here in food and ag tech in the Sacramento region, and also was recently just part of the Unreasonable Food program, which was a collaboration between Mars and the Unreasonable group, which brought together a group of founders across the world. And we really got to sit down and talk about some of the challenges facing our food system and how we can address them from all different angles, be it the alternative protein and plant based protein space, be it the animal ag space, thinking about colors, thinking about textures and precision fermentation, and how all these technologies can play a role to support the food system.
I applaud those efforts to get people to the table. Personally see such an opportunity to address that silent middle, to bring more people to the table, and often technical founders and leaders, folks they're not seeing in their everyday life, and they're not learning from those folks. And so I love always hearing when people are collaborating and learning. True food system transformation is going to take a lot of parties and time and effort. Do you consider NuCicer your work to be in the alt protein space, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up 'cause I didn't use the word alt protein. To be honest, I don't, not in the way that it's been defined. I consider the work that we're doing really in the crop development space and really enabling nutrient dense ingredients. We talk so much about protein because our first variety that was really a proof point for our breeding technology and library is a high protein variety. But as we think forward about the impact that chickpea is having, it's about protein and fiber, thinking about gut health and how these ingredients can really unlock food formulations as well when we think about textures. It goes well beyond this legacy view now of alternative protein into simply a nutritional fortification support for the industry.
And do you see yourselves or do you anticipate positioning yourselves as the experts in chickpea or in certain types of crops or thinking about protein or certain products with crops with certain nutritional characteristics? How do you think about that?
The way we think about it is chickpea is the crop we're working on today. It continues when we constantly are looking at it and analyzing all different crop opportunities. For all the reasons I've already stated, chickpea continues to rise to the top as the best option to become really a multi-market global staple ingredient for our food system. Beyond that, if we were to, let's say, go acquire a new library in another crop, all of our breeding technology can be applied there. We're constantly looking at other opportunities. I think if we marry the library with the breeding technology, and then you bring in our market expertise and understanding in those relationships, it really is to our advantage to focus on nutrient density and ingredients because that's where we're getting a really good understanding of what the system looks like there. I definitely see NuCicer staying with a focus on food and ag.
And it feels like the space is changing around us right now. The labels and the frameworks are they're shifting right now. So it's interesting to be thinking about that and looking ahead. When you think back over the last 6 years, Catherine, and watching as your company has hit these milestones, what has surprised you the most?
What has surprised me the most is actually the lack of conversation that's happening across the whole system and the segmentation that we have in ag and food. I'm going to a conference just next week, and there's 2 days of ag tech, and then there's 2 days of food tech, and they aren't combined. There's not a lot of overlap. Our food, it all starts in ag. Yes, agriculture supports other industries beyond the human food market. The opposite is not true. All of our food starts is some type of ag product. And if we think about it as an integrated system, all of a sudden there are new opportunities. I still today do not think they're happening to any degree that is actually necessary to support true system wide innovation.
Those events are very siloed, and I'll be attending Future Food Tech next week as well. But yeah, one group comes in, they leave, and the other group comes in. It's two completely different events, but in the same space. I think that's a great point. So, how can folks find out more about the work that you're doing at NuCicer?
Visit our website, follow us on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out if you have questions or you're working in the industry and want to test out some of the products that NuCicer and our partners are bringing into the market.
I really enjoyed our conversation today, Kathryn, and learning about the work that you're doing at NuCicer. I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Megan. Really great to chat today as well.
Thanks for joining us today on the latest episode of Food Tech Stories. Be sure and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and keep an eye out for our bi-weekly episodes. I'm your host, Megan Thomas, founder of Ladder 17. Food Tech Stories is edited by TJG Media.